Today we're going to talk about hardening Okta. We're trying to make this, contextualize this into what are the goals and how are you going to do this. And we're going to walk you through actual actions in the Okta console. I hope that we'll manage to go through all the content, but if not, you will also have it available as document data. Let's start talking about what we are really here to do, which is to harden Okta. But before we talk about that, we need to talk about what are the actual attacker or threat actor goals when they come in and they compromise Okta. From the initial access, what are they actually trying to achieve? So there are three high-level goals that you can discuss. One is the ability to impersonate any user, the ability to log into any user account in the identity system. The second is to achieve full control over the downstream apps or services connected to that main identity system. And the third is the complete control of the Okta superadmin privileges, allowing the attackers, in theory, to lock out the legitimate users of the identity system from them. So let's go into Okta and talk a little bit about what can we do in Okta that is not necessarily a default to make it more resilient to initial compromise. So the first thing is actually very simple. Go to the general security settings and scroll down. At the bottom, there is Okta Threat Insight. Threat Insight is an Okta threat detection mechanism trying to detect things like password spraying, credential stuffing, malicious IPs, and so on, and being used to access Okta. I highly recommend also to prevent user enumeration because it makes the work of the attackers harder, as well as limiting the activation email lifetime, even less than 7 days personally. And lastly, while we're here in the general settings, definitely enable all the security notifications to your users. Hopefully, one of them will notice something weird happening in his account and actually report this, and that would actually help you. See, the global session policy controls the sessions that your users are having. And here, it's very important to establish separate policies for admins and for regular users. Okta is very nice. They are maintaining a dynamic group of Okta administrators that you can apply the admin policy on, which they will automatically populate for you. And obviously, on the admin policy, you want to go wild because those are your Okta admins. They are your single point of failure. And honestly, most Okta admins can escalate in various ways to super admin, or at least multiple of those roles can. The other piece is think about your session management, because session hijacking using stolen session cookies and session IDs is very, very common, as we mentioned. So the one thing that you can do from here is already set limits on those sessions. Okay, so here, as we go on, the next thing after the global session policy is the specific application you're accessing. And it's important to note that Okta is modeling this admin console as an application, as well as the user dashboard as another application. So these policies also get evaluated as you log into Okta or to applications connected to Okta, like all of those that we're seeing over here. And what you need to do is basically, in general, you need one policy for the default and one policy for the sensitive application. So the Okta admin console is obviously one, but also the management console of your firewall is a sensitive application, right? Because it can change the security settings of your entire organization. So you should collect all of those sensitive applications into one policy and basically apply it to be very strict. Tokens allow us to log into Okta in general without MFA. It's very important to review them as a super admin. Look at the Okta existing tokens. Make sure you have also rotation policies that in place to make sure that the token expiration arrives, refresh token lifetime is limited, and trusted origins are controlled. And the last thing, which is one of the most worrying things, is the directory integrations. Okta comes with a very interesting feature, which is providing you with an open LDAP interface to your tenants. By default, this LDAP interface is on. If you go to this URL or whatever URL you're using in your tenant over here, you will find an LDAP interface that you can communicate with. Obviously, you need to be able to authenticate to that LDAP interface, but there is no reason to have this exposure, both from an attack surface perspective and from the perspective of having another avenue for initial compromise. So one thing that I think a lot of people are probably less aware of is that some of the attributes of identities in Okta are editable by the user themselves. And as the user is capable of editing his own attributes, he is able to either change attributes that affect his group membership to gain access to additional applications, or change the way he looks in the Okta logs in order to hide the way he appears when he does potential malicious action, what's called the spoofing logs. So this is really, really important to make sure that we either not allow at all or not allow at least the modification of any field on which another automated system relies. For example, the group rules in Okta, or the group rules in some application downstream that is thinking based or deciding on permissions based on those attributes. So let's talk about another technique, which is both very common post-exploitation technique as well as general weak configuration, which creates additional attack surface, which is applications that allow you to synchronize passwords out in different ways. This includes in Okta two different types of configurations. One is the scheme type configuration, which is basically automated provisioning, and the other is the secure web access or password saving type of situation. So here, basically, I can go into one of the applications, standard Okta application, and theoretically, as an attacker, I could go into the provisioning tab if I already compromised an admin that can edit these settings, decide that the target is my server, whatever scheme server I have, and decide to sync to the application, to this scheme server that I just configured. I can decide to enable password sync, which will get the password to be sent and to whom, to my server, and which password I can choose to sync the Okta password. Now, there is no way to disable it, so the best way is to actually not have this enabled anywhere and consider the use of syncing passwords as something, syncing the master passwords, obviously, the Okta passwords, is something that you disallow across your entire company, because this can allow the user to sync out the password even of the super administrator of all of Okta, gaining complete control of Okta. So this is very important to review your application lists and make sure that the secure web access and the scheme usage is actually being done under controlled settings without using the master password. This creates a very risky attack surface otherwise. Yeah. So one thing that is interesting is that Okta is working and improving their capabilities. And there are a lot of features that are actually pretty good in early access. Some of them are waiting there for a while. Some of them are appearing and then being released to production fairly quickly. I will point a few features that you want to do to enable in your environment based on the current Okta version. So automatic updates for your AD and LDAP agents is a fairly good idea always, as it is always with patching and updating software. Detecting lockouts caused by unknown devices is important, because otherwise attackers can basically do a denial of service attack by just attempting to log into account and getting the account locked out like this. And the Okta is adding additional permissions, which allows you to remove some of the risks from certain roles by creating custom roles instead. So for example, you can create a role equivalent to organization administrator, but without access to identity providers, which reduces one of the privilege escalation passes for that role. And Yeah, this and last thing is the phishing resistance for FastPass for iOS devices. So one thing that is very important is to obviously review your administrators. There are well-documented ways for organization administrators and application administrators to escalate privileges to super administrator. But in the case of application administrator, this applies only when they have full control of a scheme-enabled application, SWA application, or when they are unconstrained and can create applications. So let's talk about a few other things that you might want to make sure that you look at. One is the hooks. Hooks allow attackers to steal data or even modify data as it passes, especially the inline hooks that allow actually the modification. And all of those hooks go to your own webhook servers. And these webhook servers can be compromised, just like the delegation and sync agent servers. And you should treat those as the most critical infrastructure, no less critical than Okta or Active Directory in your environment. And one more thing that I will note here is the identity providers and delegated authentication. Those basically control the sources of identities into your environment. One thing that is very common in Okta, I don't have this in this environment, sadly, is the Okta Preview. Okta Preview is a second URL of Okta, oktapreview.com, which Okta uses to provide you with a secondary tenant that allows you to test new features and new capabilities. I've seen several organizations where the Okta Preview was configured as an identity provider feeding into their main organization, okta.com. The problem is that the Okta Preview is a playground. Everybody gets permissions there. Everybody can play however they like because it's the tested environment. But because they have all of these permissions, they can use those to log into any account in your main okta.com tenant if you're not setting things up carefully to prevent this. So this is extremely important to actually look at. And let's go into one of the identity provider configurations there and see what we should actually pay attention to as we review an identity provider configuration. So obviously there are some default settings, but if I go ahead and edit the settings, so one thing that is extremely important, usually an identity provider is basically using whatever the identifier it's got as the identifier that will be passed into your system. It's highly recommended, even this is the best practice and most critical one, to add a prefix. If you have a prefix to the naming that is a default prefix, you can generally prevent any type of attack that is using an upstream identity provider to get into a specific account in your environment. So really pay attention to this one. It's much better than the other alternative to this, which is using a regular expression to identify the subject name IDs that you don't want to be used. And we all know how easy it is to maintain regular expressions when usernames are changing, admins are changing in your environment, etc., etc. So this is extremely important. I highly encourage you to review all the identity providers, and similarly, all the delegated authentication environments that you have, whether those are Active Directory or LDAP based, and basically make sure that if you have any, you have set them up correctly, you have protected every agent that you have connected, and they are set up in a very safe type of environment. Really quickly, what can you monitor to be ready to respond? And what can you do to be ready to respond to actual breaches when they happen? So start by enabling all the emails. Use the Okta Dashboard, this dashboard. It has certain alerts and notifications that are useful. Next, backup the logs. The Okta default log retention is only 90 days. As Jim mentioned earlier, how many days is the statistic for discovering a breach?
Yeah, it's like over 180.
And obviously, it's better if it goes to a dedicated monitoring tool like Authomize, but other ITDR solutions as well, that is able to detect whether it's session hijacking or malicious activity in your environment, identify critical changes to configurations, like happened, for example, in MGM when an IDP was added or the delegated authentication was changed in different attacks that Okta mentioned, attributed to the same attackers in MGM. And obviously, plan your response protocols for the scenarios from above, all of these presentation and others, very carefully. Make sure, for example, that you have scripts that can allow you to suspend all users if you're in the type of critical situation like the MGM's one. Make sure that you have a break last account that allows you to go back as a super admin, or tries at least. Have all of those prepared so you have actually gone through the start exercise and prepared the tools that you would need and not find yourself trying to figure out how to establish those or to maintain access and maintain activity to a certain extent when you are in a critical situation.